we finished up Daniel chapter 2, where the king had a dream, if you remember, of this great big statue, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, basically shins of steel, and then feet and toes of steel, or not steel, iron and clay mixed, and how it was a prophecy of the different kingdoms that were going to come through. And of course, because of that, it brought Daniel into the eyes of the king and to the attention of the king. And so the king said that Daniel's God was the God of gods, and that no other God could do what Daniel's God did, which was explain a dream that he'd never told anyone. And so there's this beginning of the introduction of Nebuchadnezzar to God, and he's starting to see who God really is. But remember, back in this time, every other pantheon of gods was just that. It was a pantheon. There were many gods. And so Nebuchadnezzar, at that time, I believe, kind of adopted God, but he didn't get rid of any of his other gods. And so that leads us to Daniel chapter 3. And in verse 1, he starts off, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and width was 6 cubits. That's 90 feet tall by 9 feet wide. That is a huge statue. However, there was not enough gold in the entire empire of Babylon to build a golden statue that big. So most people believe he made it out of wood and then had it covered in gold, which makes more sense. I mean, because that's enormous. If that was actually made, there would be pieces of it somewhere still remaining. But there's no trace of this image. So he made this enormous statue, 90 feet tall. Most buildings, like in this room here, we have an 8-foot ceiling. So imagine 90 feet. You're talking 9 stories tall. That's how big this thing was. It was a huge statue. And I like to look at it, and I find it interesting that this is right after he had a dream where he saw a massive statue. And it makes me wonder if he kind of described his dream to the artists, and they said, well, we can make that for you. He says, good, but being that I'm the head of gold, I want the whole thing made out of gold. That's kind of the idea I get. That's all me. That's not biblical. But that's kind of the way I think of it. And it says at the end of verse 1 there, he says, he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word and gathered together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials from the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, All the people, nations, languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So, King Nebuchadnezzar creates this massive idol. The thing is huge, and it's all covered in gold. It had to be an amazing thing to look at. I mean, just any statue that big is pretty cool. But then for it to be covered completely in gold, it's just a really massive statue. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, he makes a decree, and he has his little herald go over there. Well, first he calls very specific people, if you notice. The satraps and the administrators, the governors and counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. So he's calling his political structure together. And he's pulling them together. The satraps were known to be over large areas. Then the administrator over smaller areas, like a governor. Then you have the governors, which were more like mayors, over smaller areas. And so you see the structure of Babylon here. And he also called all his judges and his magistrates and all of those people. So all of the political structure came together for the dedication of this image. And it was more than just worshiping this gold image. This was proclaiming your loyalty to Babylon and to King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Now, most scholars do not think that this was an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself, because there is no record in any of the Babylonian things we've found that they ever worshipped the king. But a lot of people believe that it was probably the image of the god Nebu, who Nebuchadnezzar was named after. So it's possible. We don't really know what it looked like. Like I said, there's no trace of this thing anywhere. But he called everyone together, and he says, you're going to fall down. When you hear the music strike up, the band starts going. Whenever you hear all these different instruments start playing, and you hear this sweet song playing across, you need to bow down to this image, which represents me and my kingdom. It's showing your dedication to me. And if you don't, just in case you're thinking, you know what, I don't really want to do this, if you don't, you notice the big fire pit over here. There's a burning fiery furnace. And they've actually done some study on the type of furnaces they used in Babylon at this time. And they actually had a tube system that went to the bottom, and the coals and the fuel was on the bottom. And they would actually use these huge billow type things to heat it up. And so that's how they kept it going. And they just, put in fuel, and there was a mouth to it, and then it kind of was covered in the back, and it's just this huge furnace which they could get extremely hot. And so King Nebuchadnezzar gives the signal, the band strikes up, starts playing their song, and everyone bows down. Nebuchadnezzar is happy. Everyone is proclaiming their loyalty to Babylon and to his image, and so everything is good. But then, in verse 8, it says, therefore, at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony, with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So, certain Chaldeans. Now, remember from chapter 2, it says the Chaldeans were called. These are not the same group of people. The Chaldeans called in chapter 2 were specific. They were the wisdom guys. The way this one's worded in the original language, these were the nobles. These were the conquering race that took over everything. They were the closest ones to King Nebuchadnezzar. If him and his royal line died off, these are the ones who would have taken over. That's who came up. And they came up and they said, hey, king, didn't you say, and they show their loyalty to him by quoting exactly what was required. They did it word for word. They didn't just come up and say, hey, didn't you say that if no one worshiped, they'd be thrown in the fire? No, they were like, here's your exact words. We were paying attention because we're that loyal to you. Said, didn't you say this? By the way, there are certain Jews who you have set over the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by name. They don't regard you. They don't honor you. They don't care about you. And they refuse to worship the image which you have set up. Now I want to pause here because you notice that it's just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the big question that everyone has whenever they hear this story is, where is Daniel? Now you remember how I said he called very specific people? Daniel was advanced to the royal vizier position. He was second in command in the nation. He was head over all the wise men. You notice the wise men aren't there either. All the political structure, but not the wise men. Daniel was over the wise men. He was also on King Nebuchadnezzar's royal council. He was there. So there are several different ideas on why Daniel is not at the dedication of this thing. First of all, he could have been out of town because he's the second in command. There might have been some business he was on. Second of all, never says he called, Nebuchadnezzar never called his specific position to do this, so maybe Daniel just stayed home. Third, whenever we read further on in different chapters, whenever Daniel gets some of these visions that God gives him, it makes him sick and he's in bed for several days sick. It's possible he was sick at this time. Let's see, it gave me 6 different things. Someone actually said it's possible that Daniel was so close to the king at this point that the king didn't question his loyalty, so he didn't make him go. Quite simply, it's like, I know Daniel. Daniel's loyal to me. I don't need him to be here. So there's a lot of different ideas, but Daniel was obviously not involved in this. Otherwise, it would have said Daniel was not bowing down either. There's also the other idea that Daniel was so close to the king and he had such a high position that the Chaldeans dared not accuse him because they knew the king would just kill them off. Or Daniel could, for that matter. So there's a lot of different explanations. We don't really know why, but those are some ideas. But Daniel did not bow down. I have no doubt in my mind. It's not recorded, but I have no doubt that Daniel was not one of the ones that said, okay, let me bow down to this thing, because God honored him too much. And if Daniel denied God at this point, God would have denied Daniel. That's just the way it works. So, but I love the way they tell King Nebuchadnezzar, you set them up to control the province of Babylon, which, if you remember, Daniel's actually the one that did that. And they don't regard you. You set them up, they don't care about you. What's going on, king? And so in verse 13 says, then Nebuchadnezzar, in a rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, saying, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, If you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and all symphony, with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? So, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's furious because he recognizes what the Chaldeans are saying. His nobles are saying, hey, you set these guys over us, and they don't care about you. Well, of course, that's going to spark anger in any king. I gave them my favor, and now they don't do what I tell them to? Are you kidding me? Do they not know that I have supreme command over everything? And so Nebuchadnezzar calls them up. He's furious. They come up before him. He says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? He's very clear on who he's talking to. Very clear. He says, is it true that you refuse to fall down and worship? When I told you to fall down and worship? Is it true? Is this really happening? He said, and he doesn't even give them a chance to respond at that point. He says, if you decide to go ahead and fall down, when you hear the music start up, then good. But if not, you will be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And then he has to tack on that last phrase. And who's the God that's going to stop me? See, I'm honoring this God that I made. Everyone's honoring this God that I made. Look at it. It's amazing. It's massive. Who's going to stop you? You're not worshiping the big God in the room. See, this is one reason I believe that God said, don't make any kind of molded image of me. Because there is no molded image that could compare to who God really is. Nebuchadnezzar is looking with his physical eyes, and he's like, this is the biggest idol there is. Of course, that's got to be the strongest God. That's why I made it. He's looking at the physical, whereas Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know that their God is more powerful than anything on the planet. And as, like David said, the heaven of heavens cannot contain God. Said, so they knew who their God was. And in verse 16, I love their answer. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand. Okay. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So, first of all, Nebuchadnezzar knows God. He told Daniel, oh, there's no God like your God. That's amazing. It's just amazing that you were able to do this. So Nebuchadnezzar knew God, but he didn't think that God could deliver out of his own hand. So he didn't know the extent of God's power, but he had been introduced already. So this is, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they just stand up and they don't get the second chance. If you read this story, they never get the second chance. Because Nebuchadnezzar says, the next time I play, if you fall down, that's great. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego look at it and say, yeah, we don't need to do that. You don't need to strike up the band again. It's not going to happen. They said, we have no need to answer you in this matter. We don't even need to reply. They said, if that's the case, if what you said is true, our God, who we serve, he is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. He has that power. And he will definitely deliver us from your hand, either way. But if he doesn't deliver us from the fiery furnace, and we go in there, know this, that even if we die, we still aren't serving your gods. It doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter how you threaten us. Even if you kill us here on the spot, know this, we die not worshiping your God. But notice that they still give honor to the king. They never disrespect him. They followed his commands up until the point where it broke God's commands. And then they said, sorry, we can't cross this line. They showed up. When he said come, they came. When he said stand in front of the image, they stood in front of the image. They did everything he said except bow down. They followed his rules. So many people try and use the fact that our government is so ungodly to not follow the government's laws. And it's like, no, that's not the way Christians are supposed to act. You are supposed to follow the laws until they cross God's laws. Then you have God's right to stand and say, no, I'm not going to do that. And so they're still honoring the king, but they're telling him, God can save us from this fire. That's not a problem. But even if he doesn't, we will die. And you will know that we died not worshiping your God. Because we don't serve him. So of course, Nebuchadnezzar was not very happy. In verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was so urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar was so mad. He said, start pumping those billows, make that fire hot, throw in extra fuel, and make sure that thing is just blazing hot. 7 times is what he ordered. And man, those people that were working those billows started pumping. They threw in extra wood because it was getting like disintegrating the minute they got it. It was so hot. And he calls his commanders. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't even try and run. They just stood there. Because they trusted God. And the certain mighty men of valor, these are important people in the army. They came forward and Nebuchadnezzar was like, okay, bind them up. Don't just throw them in. Let's tie them up. And he had them tied up with all their coats and everything. Man, they're like, we're not even going to strip you of all your royal garments because these people were heads of state. So they had nice clothes on. Their turbans, they had everything all nice and good. They tied them up. Picked them up like logs. Went to the mouth of this furnace and threw them in. And as they're throwing them in, I don't know if you've ever been next to an extremely hot campfire or not. I've gotten my face chapped because of campfires, because I like really hot campfires. But I understand what happened. They got so close that they threw them in, and the heat billowed out at the right time, and it killed the men who were throwing them in. That's how hot it was. Instant death to the people not even in the fire. Threw all of them in. They fell down, bound into the fire, onto all that fuel, while the billows were still going. These guys were in a bad situation according to human sight. But look what happens in verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he arose in haste and spoke saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? I love this. He is so confused on what he is seeing. He knew exactly who he threw in. He called them by name 3 times. He knew there were 3 people. He says, didn't we throw 3 people in? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. In verse 25 he says, look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. He's looking in, and he sees Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walking around on the fuel, talking with who I believe is Jesus. Standing there, just talking with him. Jesus in his glorified body, because he says he looks like, well, in the King James and the New King James, they translate it the Son of God. But in the original language, because you got to remember, Nebuchadnezzar was not a God-fearing man. At least not our God. He had many gods. And the original language actually says the Son of the gods, plural. People have gotten so upset whenever people translate that properly and say the Son of the gods, because they're like, oh, they're taking out Jesus. They're taking Jesus out of the Bible. No, that's going back to the original language. Remember who said what in the Bible. A polytheistic person who believes in multiple gods will not say the Son of the God, because he believes in multiple gods. But he looks, and there's something different about the 4th man. There's something different. And Nebuchadnezzar is so confused, because he's like, we threw 3 guys in. I named them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You want their Hebrew names? Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Those are the 3 people. Where's that 4th one come from? He looks like he could be the son of a god. He is amazing. You remember the Mount of Transfiguration whenever Jesus came down? His skin shone. He was suddenly bright. He was clothed differently. That's who's walking around in the midst of the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar is so confused that he has to ask his counselors, did we accidentally throw a 4th person in there? Did you guys grab an extra one just in case? I mean, what's going on? And so they're like, no, there's only 3. And so in verse 26 it says, then Nebuchadnezzar went over to the mouth of the burning fire furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. See, he recognizes it now. Come out and come here. I love the fact that he didn't call the 4th person. Call me crazy. I saw the 4th person. I think it's the Son of a God. You better believe I'd be like, and bring your friend. I need to meet him. But he didn't call the 4th person. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire, verse 27, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose body the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. This was, this is more than just the fire didn't hurt them. The fire didn't hurt them, didn't hurt their clothes, didn't hurt their hair. I've always been a bit of a pyromaniac. I love fire, I always have. And I've been in places where I haven't even been in the flame, and my hair has shriveled a little bit. Okay, I've done things and I've looked, and all of a sudden I have no hair on my hands. It's fire and hair. Man, hair gets anyone near a fire, it goes away. Their hair was not singed at all. Their clothes had no mark. And beyond that, they didn't smell like a fire. And that has got to be the most amazing thing, because there's times whenever I don't even play in the fire that I still smell like the campfire when I come home, just because I was in the vicinity of it. The people working the billows probably smelled like a campfire. All the other people probably smelled like a campfire. But these 3 didn't. God goes beyond just the protection. This is where it says, 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. That's what it's talking about. There's a barrier that in the physical eye, it looks like you just got hit. But with the spiritual eye, it never really got anywhere near you. And that came so clear to me after I had my stroke. Because God told me very clearly, people were saying left and right, you almost died. Because I had that massive stroke. The left side of my brain didn't have blood for 8 to 10 hours. And everyone was saying, we almost lost Nathaneal. He almost died. And God was very clear. He said, you never came close to death because it did not come near you. They said I would be in the hospital, in the recovery ward for over 6 months, and I walked out of there in 2 days. Why? Because God said, it's not coming near you. The devil can throw death at you as much as he wants. It's not coming near you. Because it's not God's time for you to die. It never came near Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They walked around in that fire like it didn't hurt them because the fire probably didn't even touch them. There was a layer of protection around them, and the fire came up against it and stopped. And so they walked around and explored the fiery furnace and talked with Jesus. Isn't it interesting that the ropes burned off?
Yeah.
They were tied up. I believe that while they were in the air falling, those ropes just went and just disintegrated because of the heat. They hit the ground, they just stood up. And Jesus said, you guys all right? Let me help you up. And that's what it was. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. See, King Nebuchadnezzar did not believe that any God could do that kind of a deliverance. Not his God, nor any other God. Because all he did was trust in these fake gods. And so for this to happen, he was amazed. And he said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel, because Jesus was in his glorified body, it was bright and glowing, he didn't know what else to call it, sent his angel who protected his servants so that they did not have to worship any god but their own, and frustrated my commands. Blessed be that God. He said they yielded their own body. He said, therefore, you remember last week on how they liked to execute people in Babylon. It wasn't cut in pieces. It was torn in pieces. It says, anyone who says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we are going to go ahead and tear him apart into pieces. Then we're going to make his house an ash heap. Nebuchadnezzar loved this threat, man. This was his go-to. We are going to literally rip you to pieces, and we're going to burn down your house, which means your family's not going to survive. This is, you better watch yourself, because I'm not just wiping you out, I'm wiping out your whole line. Nothing's going to happen. You don't talk bad against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. Because there is no other God who can do this. So in chapter 2, Daniel showed that God was all-knowing to Nebuchadnezzar, and he understood that. He says no other God could reveal secrets like this. In chapter 3 here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show that God is all-powerful. I'm telling you, King Nebuchadnezzar is getting an education in Old Testament theology real quick. Things are happening that is showing him, hey, you might want to pay attention, because the only reason you are where you are is because God lets you be there. And then, of course, in verse 30, he says, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They already had high positions. Now they're really high positions. And everyone's afraid to say anything against them, just like they are Daniel. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for today. Lord, thank you for this story of how you deliver and how you take care of your people. Lord, I pray that whenever we go through the trials and problems of life, we know that no matter what happens, you're next to us, you're helping us, you're protecting us and keeping us. Help us always to keep that in mind, and help us to depend on you more, Lord God, because so many times we start to depend on other things in this world instead of just trusting in you. Help us to always put our trust in you no matter what. Lord, help us to grow in you and to be the people you want us to be. Take us from here. Let us go through this week and be a good witness to you everywhere we go and in everything we do. Lord, bring us back safely next week. In Jesus' name we pray.